gentlemen, welcome to the Danube Institute for tonight's discussion, the topic of which is Making the Machine Go, Dominic Cummings as Management Guru. I'm Gavin Haynes, a visiting fellow, and I'm joined tonight by two gurus in their own right, Nathan Levine, who is a visiting fellow here for another month. Nathan is a China expert, but he's perhaps more renowned these days as one of the most striking big-picture voices on Substack, where he blogs at The Upheaval. He has over 50,000 subscribers. And Andrew Sabisky, an analyst at Bismarck Analysis, and more importantly, a former advisor to Dominic Cummings in number 10 Downing Street. In fact, he was personally recruited by the PM's office by Cummings via an open casting call that drew in over 10,000 CVs. The point of this discussion is to take Dominic Cummings seriously, to establish Cummingsology as a discipline in British political thought. Why do that? Well, it's often said that people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And here is a person who, in his own way, stands in for a tendency. After all, there were plenty of socialists before Marx, including Engels, but it was one voice that became the one through which a vast set of ideals were refined and then rallied around. Marx borrowed, but the way he borrowed and the terminal force of his arguments allowed a bigger picture debate to be channeled through him. So too with Cummings. He's become the standard bearer for others, for a movement that doesn't yet have a name, but does now have a guy. His followers are those who see that what he is saying is a more true, more real representation of how bureaucracy works and what to do about it. These people may already have read the primary sources that he draws heavily on, and they will often have their own angles and disagreements on those sources, plenty of Mensheviks to go round. But in terms of driving the argument forward, for now, in Britain, most recognise that he is the avatar of their ideology. So what is Dominic Cummings' thought, if you want to label it like that, like Chairman Mao thought or Xi Jinping thought? Well, the first thing to say about Dominic Cummings' thought is that it is definitely thought. This immediately distinguishes it from most of the rest of British political discourse. Secondly, it is thought that has come to us as politics, but not from within political philosophy. It has nothing much to do with Michael Oakeshott or Thomas Hobbes. Rather, the thought that makes Cummings stand out has come to us from a recent and practically focused grammar of management theory, often from places like Silicon Valley. After all, today, Silicon Valley is where we make our cathedrals. That is the 5-minute warning. The nukes are about to drop. Fantastic. Well, after that brief diversion, where was I? I was in Silicon Valley, and it's where we make our cathedrals, where complex teams build huge projects on the cutting edge at vast scale. It's an obvious candidate for practical expertise in how to get things done. And increasingly, that corpus of knowledge of lots of people thinking about these problems has solidified into its own kind of code. It's set about with the cultural assumptions, of course, of a certain type of largely American person. Often the type who sits in a small dark room 12 hours a day on Adderall, listening to ambient techno and punching out code. The intellectual pedigree of these people follows their function. They are utilitarian. They see the world as solvable. They believe in better. They struggle to conceive of life for those with IQs of below 130. And often, this bent has led them towards progressivism. But it needn't always. If the management theory is the hard centre, then the more cultural component of this worldview is in the intellectual fashions of the rationalist and post-rationalist movements. These were born on blogs like Less Wrong and Slate Star Codex in the early 2010s. They're obsessed with using data to refine decision-making. They are empiricist, instinctively atheist, deeply utilitarian. Essentially, it's what John Stuart Mill would have come up with if he'd had a lead dev role on the Google campus. Somewhat crass, but curiously practical. Philosophy that works in bite-sized chunks to solve the world. Of course, Dominic Cummings also has genuinely political heroes, but his political heroes are never the Allendes, they're never tragic triers, martyrs to their ideology. They aren't even people who put a particular mode of thinking on the map, like Margaret Thatcher. His heroes are pragmatists, people who get things done. First, there's his abiding love of Bismarck, the subject of his university dissertation. Then, there's Lee Kwan Yeu, the father of modern Singapore, whose autobiography and sayings now have the feel of the Book of Acts to a certain class of young, impatient British rightist. Lee Kwan Yeu built the highest GDP per capita of any nation over 1 million people, and he built it from the Malayan swamp. The lessons are all there for those who will read. Indeed, one of Cummings' key sayings is precisely that. It's that the smartest people in the world have written down 80% of all the good ideas they ever had. All you have to do is, actually read them. And that thought brings us on to the crux of tonight. British politics does not read. It is not intellectually curious. It's a ghost ship, a dead player. The cycle is this. Ministers get into position, they have things they want to achieve, they wave their arms in pursuit of those goals, they are then baffled when, having pulled the lever, the machinery of government does nothing. This annoys them for 5 minutes, it enrages them a little longer, they send off for answers, the answers come back with fresh problems baked in, then they switch jobs, forget what just happened, and the cycle continues infinitely. When you look at the sclerotic society that Britain has become, it's kind of obvious why. Like Amazonian tribes debating a comet, they huddle together to figure out what will come from a fresh change of government. A change of PM, sheer ministerial will, fresh legislation. Or the latest bauble, exiting the ECHR. It doesn't occur to them that there are answers to their questions, that big or new or foreign ideas might well apply here to the project of projects, to making the machine go. So the message that Cummings has for us as a management theorist is firstly simply that better is possible. The rest of what Cummings Thought has to say on the subject is varied. Like many an eminent philosopher, through his 10,000-word Substack posts, he writes in a style between Buddhist koans and Hegel, at once verbose and abrupt. A staccato, but an endless, beginningless staccato. This can make it hard to piece together a clear schema for Cummingsologists like myself. Where does the beginning begin? So let's start out by laying a few of the chess pieces on the board through his sources and through his interpreters. I asked my sometime colleague Andrew Collingwood, another Cummingsologist, to define what he sees as Cummings' central ideas on management. He replied, 1. Speed is a value in and of itself. It seems like it's more expensive to do things quickly, but it's actually cheaper and more efficient and produces better results. 2. Set the overall goal, pick the right people to run it, and then let them run it. 3. Everybody working on the task should know the overall goal and what everybody else is doing at any given time. 4. Spend time on the organizational system before starting. Who will do what? Who will report to whom? How people will communicate. 5. Set tasks and give teams broad, cross-departmental authority to get things done. 6. Start with the bad news. When reporting to managers, setbacks and problems must come first. 7. Effective managers are often not ones to schmooze. They're blunt. 8. Finally, do not be sidetracked by new goals or political imperatives. Do not add layers of complexity to the goal. Now, what about the sources? What is Dominic Cummings reading? Where does his thinking come from? Well, I've built a cross-section of the truly exhaustive reading list found at the back of his blog and pulled out a few of the books that Cummings seemed to see as foundational on the subject of management. They are Now It Can Be Told, which is the story of the Manhattan Project, centered around the personage of General Groves, its leader. Groves was a typically gruff, cigar-chopping, pattern-like figure who organized his workers with a strict, ultra-clear chain of command while devolving power day to day. He used an aggressive sense of urgency to drive progress, and he broke up silos or cliques wherever he found them. Then there's Working Backwards. This is a fairly standard business book that unpeels Amazon's unique working methods. Those are always begin with the end in mind, hyper-focus on the user, don't let meetings go on, delete low performers, and vigorously reward and promote competence. Of course, there's Silicon Valley favorite High Output Management, which is by the founder of Intel, Andy Grove. Grove founded the widely applied tool of OKRs. Without getting too much into the weeds of those, the key takeaway is that measuring your outputs drives what you make. Then there's Skunk Works, the story of the Lockheed team who figured out how to make a supersonic spy plane. These were led by the typical renegade, results-oriented hard-ass Kelly Johnson, who kept his team in a sort of shed at the back of the Lockheed building, putting them well away from the bureaucracy of a major arms manufacturer. Finally, there's Boyd, the fighter pilot who changed war. Colonel John Boyd was a US Navy pilot and a typical cigar-chomping hard-ass who became a military theorist and invented the idea of the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. If you can do one or four of these faster than your opponent, Boyd says, you set them into a spiral of disorientation and disorganization that is the pathway to victory. Many of Boyd's insights later formed the strategic basis for the US strategy in Gulf War I. Cummingsism, then, looks a bit like this. It's a philosophy built around working in small teams of highly motivated, highly screened individuals who take radical responsibility and are delegated radical power. These individuals work to well-thought-out goals. Everyone knows the goal is clear, the goal is primary, and the nice-to-haves are rigorously guarded against. Oh, and the team leader must be a cigar-chomping American military man. It's perhaps not coincidence that Cummingsism seems to worship a certain kind of bluff yet brilliant renegade, someone who's feared and loved in equal measure. The comparison is certainly flattering. But is it a cohesive theory? Does it add anything? In a way, Cummings's ideas are so much bric-a-brac. One easy critique to make is that he's a magpie. He's simply a reader. He's a noticer. But then, many theorists are dreadful at practice. Clausewitz never really went to war. The architectural theorist, the Smithsons, built dreadfully ugly buildings. But that isn't the case here. Let's take 5 points of winning. There was Cummings's first major project, Business for Sterling, which pushed the pendulum towards Britain staying out of the single currency. The Northeast Regional Assemblies referendum he won. There was the No to AV referendum, Brexit, then the Christmas election. Cummings brought out of semi-retirement to lead Boris's campaign, swinging him a stunning majority, and then getting Brexit done. The picture on the pandemic is more mixed, but he had one great hit, using his agile management philosophies to build the vaccines task force, which allowed Britain to get more vaccines faster than the rest of Europe. These are individually impressive. Collectively, they're much more than that. They're a signal in the noise. There's something that this man knows about building teams. But by the end of 2020, Cummings had a cardboard box full of belongings and was strolling out of number 10 Downing Street, the loser of a palace intrigue with the PM's new wife. Evidently, agile team building was no match for a Madame Mao on the make. After he left, the incoming administration dissembled his data teams, which had worked to create dashboards of crucial government info inside Downing Street, and the UK DARPA project he'd been so keen on was pulled before it could take off. The hole closed over. Government went back to doing what it does best. Not much. Today, he's a lion in winter to some, fulminating from the pulpit of his Substack, talking vaguely of a comeback of building a startup party which would reform the country within 15 years and then abolish itself. That's a convenient kind of position to be in, armchair quarterbacking, rank punditry perhaps. But he did call the fall of Liz Truss, the obliteration of Sunak, and the total victory of Trump, so not entirely rank compared to most. The successes are there, but they are still the successes of one man. To be an ism, he would have to be reproducible. And there are still many paradoxes at the heart of Cummings-ism. The most obvious is that he's an anti-technocracy technocrat. In a sense, his message is not tear down the elites, it's simply your elite is wrong. It's people like us who should be running things, A players, people who love tech, people who wear OpenAI t-shirts to their first day of work, steeped in that particular law. He seems to hold open the door to slashing down the old institutions, but what he wants to replace them with is, in a way, just a different set of men with clipboards. Better clipboards, of course, sharper pocket protectors. Ideas matter. That's Cummings' key claim. Smarter is still possible. That's the positive vision. But while ideas might have people, they can also possess people. An amusing recent piece in the journal J'accuse compared Cummings to another arguable German hero, Erich Ludendorff, the military commander and sometime co-dictator of First World War Germany. Quote, "They share a certain credulity towards ideas. Bismarck had little use for ideas, but with these two, who do not have personal ambition as a star to sail by, we regularly find them drifting towards all manner of palm readers and spoon benders." Ludendorff, after much flitting between Freemasons, Jews and Jesuits, settled on the desertion of the Norse gods as the cause of Germany's problems. Cummings, after similar flitting, has arrived at something no less mythological, the social doctrine of status and pop evolutionary psychology. Both sought to carry out a revolutionary program for essentially conservative ends. Socially, politically, Cummings now occupies a role very similar to that of Ludendorff's in 1920s Germany. A discredited general of the last war whose innovative methods still earns them a certain admiration. And, like Ludendorff, Cummings has now fallen in with an obscure gang of malcontents and fabulists. Here, the obscure gang of malcontents and fabulists referred to is a group of so-called Anglo-futurists who are trying to become a movement. These are young Turks who have been reading very much the same stuff as Cummings, who take a utilitarian, empirical approach to making policy, which, again, descends from the rationalists of Less Wrong and Slate Star Codex. More graphs, more low-hanging fruit. The implication of the J'accuse piece is that this approach can't win. Nothing can be done without an appeal to real politics, to the sort of thing Bismarck would do. And interestingly, when Cummings was asked by the podcast host Dwarkesh Patel about what could be done to save the dismal British government, he didn't talk about stormtrooper-style small teams. Instead, he referred to a more big-picture, vibes-based thing, to culture, elite culture, to the culture that Lee Kwan Yeu had instilled in Singapore, of finding the smartest, most effective people and working on getting them to genuinely prioritise the national interest over their bureaucratic empire building. This is not exactly a replicable formula. It would take years, maybe decades, to build that kind of elite. And in the interview, Cummings concluded effectively that sometimes it happens, but sometimes it doesn't. Management consultancy is often described as IQ as a service, the application of well-tested external systems to your internal processes by clever reorganisers. But the more I've actually spoken to management consultants, the more I've come to understand that it is anthropology almost all the way down. Anyone can sell you a fancy Excel spreadsheet and a few automations. What governance, management, anything requires is more often sitting down with the CFO and the CIO to discuss why they're constantly undermining each other in meetings. It's mapping out the true power structures of an organisation, often far removed from the simple organogram. Sometimes it's hugging it out. The curse of the wonk is to believe that reality can be fitted around their big ideas, not to study the true terrain of battle, which is overwhelmingly social. and in that sense is genuinely political. You might want to argue that the danger in Cummings is that he is a wonk who believes he's not a wonk. Dangerous in that he thinks he's developed a superior theory to wonkdom, but rather than PPE and Treasury brain, he just has MBA and Silicon Valley brain. The Anglo-futurist crowd that forms that one fan base wants a world in which the marginal gains of efficiency are realised, but they are also descended from a more progressive neoliberal set. For them, for every problem, there's a market, and in the past they've aggressively argued for mass immigration on the totally reasonable grounds that it makes the GDP line go up. And that is the issue with a lot of this wonkist thinking, that it captures gains that might be micro-rational, but are macro-irrational. Like its enemies on the left, it has no particular theory of second-order causes. In any neophyte ideology, you run up against Chesterton's fence pretty quickly. It's all very well to be brilliant and say, why haven't people done this before? But that's a question of the problem of knowledge. Caution is at least evolutionarily useful. And it's a question that instantly brings us back towards the true nature of politics, human envy and human fear. What, then, is to be done? Suppose power is achieved. How does that actually play out? Well, lately, Cummings has been saying that the way to enact his proposed regime is with an arcane political instrument, orders in council. Effectively, the British version of Trump's executive orders. These would be used to sack civil servants who were not with the programme, to secure funding for new departments and ventures, and this obscure idea has been taken up by others, notably the former UKIP MP, Douglas Carswell. Even more radically, Cummings now suggests abolishing the permanent civil service almost entirely in favour of a much more modular, project-based one. If it happened, his ideology would be nothing short of a revolution, certainly up there with 1945, but maybe even with 1688. Radical it may be, but then this sort of thing no longer feels entirely off the map. The Overton window bulges in Trump's Washington. Around the Potomac, Elon Musk's DOGE units are bursting into federal buildings armed with NVIDIA chips and gunning down payroll lists, sending government employees for re-education on the unemployment lines. DOGE often deploys prodigiously young, incredibly smart analyst commissars with absolute power to act in tiny teams to rake over and interrogate federal data. The parallel is obvious, and the roots are the same. Musk's genius is in his capacity to weaponize autism, to create organizational structures that do not suffer fools gladly. Where no one has meetings about meetings, and the ruthless focus is on bringing home the target objective. A few weeks back, Musk infamously issued federal employees with a very short email. 5 lines, right back saying, what you got done this week. Are you driving value? If the Thatcher revolution was about creating internal price structures and markets where there weren't any, perhaps this one is just about creating a clarity of goals. It's a revolution of parsimony. After all, the modern world is swamped in addenda, subsumed with climate targets, diversity obligations, reporting responsibilities, safety needs. It's the true story of a planning application on a traffic tunnel that was longer than the tunnel itself. At scale, doing anything at all is hard enough. To the extent that you empower these forces, or even let them live inside your organizations, you destroy your capacity to act in the world. The revolution is in finding an intellectual framework that will slice through the tertiary stuff without damaging what's actually functional. Musk famously sacked 80% of Twitter's staff. The place wobbled and then kept going. Rumours of its impending doom have been stuck in the liberal media's outbox for 2.5 years now. Like Colonel Boyd's OODA loop principle, Musk's success is in part characterised by his capacity to run and gun, to leave his enemies in disarray by the sheer speed and unpredictability of his decision-making and decision-implementing capacity. Of course, this is all very exciting in the destructive phase of creative destruction. But what about the day after? Both Musk and Cummings must still deal with the question of whether government bureaucracy is actually ever a good fit for their methods. It's always going to be big, bigger than you can imagine in the case of the federal bureaucracy. It's always going to be procedural. These are both pretty immutable laws. For its part, Silicon Valley thrives on startup culture, to start up with 10 people and then become 100, then 500, then 5,000. That's what it's good at. After that, though, is it really immune to the problems of large organizations? Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, used to be obsessed with the idea of deleting middle management. He believed that corporate life's ills came from the armies of account managers, resource coordinators, and assistant section heads that any large company accretes. Always and everywhere, he tried to tear down these positions, constantly pulling the barnacles off his boat. Google prioritized a flat structure designed to naturally channel communication. But it failed. In the end, Sergey Brin had to back down. No managers was a disaster. In truth, it turned out that communication required people asking, what's happening with the Jones account for the third time that week? It required quick catch-ups, soundings out, and people whose only job was to make sure that everyone else did theirs. 25-year-old weaponized autists are very good at doing one thing. But as the tech world has shown in its latter, more mature years, it also seems to take a 31-year-old woman with the job title Scrum Master to get them to do the right thing at the right time and make sure it's right with the client. No one can quite explain what these people do. They even had to invent a title like Scrum Master, but they do know that without it, you have a 1 in 5 chance of a wheel popping off. And when you're traveling at speed, you don't want that. To look at Google today, well, you might be looking at the Federal Department of Internet Searches. Bloat, economic rents, second-order objectives have all led to a decline that has meant no truly innovative products have been produced there in the past decade. So, in conclusion, is this prophecy from our guru, or is it mere ravings? What are we to make of the Hegelian koans of Dominic Cummings? Well, perhaps his true meaning is not even in the theory status, but actually in the guru status. Here is someone smart enough to be widely looked towards, yet disagreeable enough to stand outside of the system, a collector of enemies, a sump for dissent, and yet morally positioned to cast the moneylenders from the temples. Today, it seems that all across Britain, and indeed the wider West, an inchoate rage is rising. We seem to be at the end of something measured in centuries. Trump's tariffs might be the most manifest vision of how close we are to the seams of history. Everywhere, our institutions seem to be failing, decrepit, burnt out, useless. Is the real message here simply in the courage, arrogance even, to reverse that decline? Where righteous anger meets genuine curiosity, that's where you'll find Cummings-ism. Revolutions often emerge from outside the palace walls, but they're often performed by those who used to be insiders, who understand the full scale of the mess that lies within. Beware of a hard-ass colonel with big ideas. That's all I'm saying. Thank you. And so, without further ado, we move over to our panel. And Andrew, I've spoken at length about the guru himself and his theories and his wants and needs, but you have personal knowledge of the guru. You have touched his cloth, and I believe you'll be selling relics in the bar afterwards. So, just as a sort of an opener, what is he like? What is he like to you?
He's always been super nice to me.
Great.
I mean, you know. Can you be more specific?
Is that an accurate picture of how he functions on a day-to-day basis? When he comes into the office, what is it like? How do people snap to attention? How does he is he just a kind of a BlackBerry man, as we used to say? Like, what is the emotional temperature of his world?
As long as you don't try to BS him, as long as you kind of just like use straightforward English and communicate your point of view, you'll be fine. He's pretty meek and mild mannered. He's not going to yell at you unless he thinks you're trying to bullshit him.
Okay.
I mean,
and what?
It's much less terrifying than he's made out to be.
And I mean, what is your story of coming into contact with him? What did he have you do?
Well, I was supposed to be working on the Integrated Review, which was our big defence review. Britain usually does defence reviews once every 5 years, where we review our foreign policy, and our defence spending, our defence policy. Usually, what's going on is that the Ministry of Defence is bankrupt in some form or another. The background here is that after the financial crisis, the coalition government came to power in 2010, and their plan was, we need to fix the public finances. We just had this giant shock to the public finances. We just bailed out all the banks. The country is pretty broke, so just cut. So they cut a bunch of military spending very aggressively, without thinking too hard about what they were cutting. Just to give one example, Britain is an island, as I'm sure you know, and we have nuclear weapons which go around in submarines that are supposed to stay underwater for months at a time. But when these submarines are vulnerable is when they are getting in and out of port, right? That's when they're most vulnerable. It's when it's easiest to find them, right? Because you roughly know where they're going to be and when they're going in and when they're going out. So in order to make sure, let's say there's no Russian submarines in the area when you're sending your nuclear submarines in and out of port, you have maritime patrol aircraft to patrol the seas from the air. For Britain in particular, maritime patrol aircraft are really, really useful. That was one of the things that got cut in the 2011 cuts and did not get restored until about 4 or 5 years later. So that happened in 2010, 2011. In 2014, Russia-Ukraine Part 1 happened, and everyone freaked out. Everyone realized, oh no, we went too far in a few places. So in the 2015 election, the Conservatives committed to restoring a bunch of the things they'd cut only 4 years earlier, but without ever really committing the funds to pay for it. So by the time we came along in sort of 2019, 2020, the Ministry of Defence was really bankrupt, and it got to the point where the permanent secretary, then a man called Sir Stephen Lovegrove, had been going around in public telling anyone who would listen that his department was effectively bankrupt, which is a very unusual thing in Britain for permanent secretaries to do. I don't know about Hungary, but in Britain it's unusual. Just to give you one concrete example, the army was trying to squeeze 4 simultaneous armoured vehicle procurement programs into a budget that was at most going to accommodate 2.5. So some hard choices had to be made, and what I was particularly interested in was trying to bring about some sort of embed some sort of forecasting realism into the process of defense procurement. Because programs costing in the end far more than people think they will at the beginning is a chronic problem for defense procurement, not just in Britain but in a lot of other places. So that was kind of what I was there to do. In the end, I sort of came to the conclusion that in order to really fix this problem, you would need to do a sort of a complete overhaul of who controls budgets within the Ministry of Defence, which was not done at the time. The current Labour government is actually moving a little bit more in that direction towards some of the ideas I was thinking about at the time, but I would probably not far enough. But I'm glad they're going in the right direction. Anyway,
okay.
That's a very long answer.
Yeah, but then in terms of what you observed in terms of the function or dysfunction of the machine and how that could potentially be made better and how much Cummings was actually making it better, I guess is the salient point. What did you see?
Well, I mean, I was there for a very brief period, and they'd only the 2019 election had just happened a few months beforehand. And then a month afterwards, the whole place got plunged into complete chaos due to COVID. The pandemic happened. But I can certainly give you some examples of particularly sort of crazy things that you just notice from the first day, sort of walking the door at number 10. For one thing, number 10 is it's where the Prime Minister actually lives, on the flat above the building, but it's also almost in a sense kind of like a public museum. There'll be like, school kids wandering around like a school trip. And you're trying to find, Rajiv, who works in the policy unit, and it's not just one building, it's about 4 or 5 different buildings of how all the walls knocked out and all joined together. So you want to find him, he's in some tiny room, 5 floors down, 20 doors across. And you bump into some kids in the process. The Downing Street Cafe closes, I think, every day at 5 p.m. and it's tiny and the food is unbelievably bad. I mean, just terrible. It's third world. None of the, free tea, free coffee that you get at, any modern office place. You go to, Google, Facebook, any of that, any hedge fund, nope, nada. You don't actually get free coffee if you work there. You only get given free coffee if you bring in a guest from outside. Then they'll serve you free coffee. I'm not making this up, and I don't think this has changed. And then, I on a more serious note, I say on a more serious note, if you can't get those things right, if you can't get the coffee right, you're not going to get the big things right either, right? But on a more serious note, it was the one thing that really stood out was how the British state just does not support its prime ministers at all. And it just doesn't work with them. It doesn't try to adapt itself to them in any way, shape, or form. And I think the Americans do a bit of a better job of this. There was a very interesting podcast I listened to a while back with a lady who did Trump's President's Daily Briefing, not actually daily, but most days, on behalf of the intelligence services, and how she really worked hard trying to adapt that to sort of what he liked and how he found it. What format he found beneficial, which is something the Americans have been working on for a long time. Many presidents have expressed dissatisfaction with aspects of their daily briefing. But here in Britain, things are a little different. So when I was there, the Ministry of Defence were coming over for what's called a stock take. A stock take is a thing that kind of dates back to Tony Blair's time in office. And really, it's sort of like a group therapy session where the department in question, the one that's having the stock take, comes over to talk to number 10 about their problems, and we all get around in a room to say, well, look, how can we fix this? How can we work together to fix your problems? So the Ministry of Defence were coming over, and they sent their slides over for what they wanted to talk about, how they were bankrupt, essentially. So we had a pre-meeting to look at those slides, and in the pre-meeting, it was me, Dom, Boris, who was the Prime Minister, Mark Sedwell, who was Cabinet Secretary, John Bew, who was the Boris's kind of personal foreign affairs advisor, and a very accomplished academic, very smart guy, and one other guy whose name I don't remember. So I look at these slides the MOD have sent over, and I just think, oh no. So the slides, all they are is just sort of acronyms and numbers. The acronyms are weapons programs, the numbers are budgets. And I look at this and I think, there's just no way Boris is going to be able to understand any of this. And there's no reason why he should. There's no reason, unless no Prime Minister would understand this. It's not a Boris thing. Unless the Prime Minister sort of already was a defence nerd, or maybe he'd already been Secretary of State for Defence, right? No Prime Minister would get this. This guy didn't need this. He needed an explainer of, what is a tank? What is a tank is a good question, because then you get into, what is a tank? How does it differ from an infantry fighting vehicle? Why are all our tanks currently parked on Salisbury Plain? Are we hoping the Russians can invade Salisbury Plain and we can fight them there? Because that's where the tanks are. Very hard to move a tank. So, then you can get into those questions, and then once you get into that, then Boris can make some sort of decision. So anyway, when the actual stock take happened, of course, it was just 2 hours of rambling chaos. Part of this was Boris's fault, because he's not very good at chairing a meeting, God bless him. So there were other things that went wrong, but just the most basic capacity to ensure that the Prime Minister has the information he needs in a form that he can comprehend, a form that he can digest, something that's actually helpful to him, is just not there and doesn't happen. Which I think is basically downstream of the fact that Number 10 is a tiny institution, and there are about 40 people in Number 10 who the Prime Minister himself has appointed. 40. It's not many.
Absolutely, yeah, and there's a lot of talk about potentially creating a department of the Prime Minister in a future administration, expanding out so that the Prime Minister has the capacity to act.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is not revolutionary stuff, right? The Institute for Government, which is, for those who don't know, the Institute for Government is sort of an avatar of the British blob. It's an avatar of sort of centre-left elite thought. The Institute for Government, prior to the recent election, prior to the 2024 election, published a report on reforming the centre of government that, was basically everything Dom's been saying for years, just translated into more polite, blob-friendly language, right? Like, I have never met anyone who has worked in British politics who has actually disagreed with Dom's critique of the British state and how it doesn't work. Everyone knows the centre of government needs very, very, very large-scale reform. This is not controversial. Not on the left, not on the right, not in the centre.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that reform is actually feasible? I mean, do you think there is a world in which small teams taking radical action with a kind of a modular view works?
Well, I don't know about this whole small teams thing. I mean, that's kind of what we've got now, and it doesn't work. I mean, I am Sabisky thought, as opposed to Cummings thought, is much more on the side of quantity as a quality all of its own. I think that quote is famously attributed to Stalin, but he didn't say it. It was made up by American defense consultants. But it really is true, and you could decatuple the number of special advisors working in British government easily. You could go from about 120 to 140. It doesn't vary much between administrations. Go to 1,500, and you would probably still be a little bit short of where you need to be. So I don't know about this whole small teams thing. That's other people's concern.
Right. So
I'm not interested in small. I mean, the smallish teams, but you don't want to get to maybe the scale of Google or whatever. It's maybe they're a bit too big.
Nathan Levine, you are a China expert. The Chinese Politburo is a large, inscrutable and unwieldy thing, and yet it has been quite effective in modern times, certainly from the view of outsiders. In your experience, is there efficacy within that? Does it have a sense of self-propulsion, and is that driven by just being autocratic?
Well, I think there's an interesting paradox with the Chinese system, because on the one hand, one of its advantages is that it's actually very decentralized in the sense that the various provinces and local governments of China have a tremendous amount of autonomy to experiment with their own policies and to do their own thing. At the first level before those policies are adopted nationwide, say. And that produces a very helpful way to do things in China that I think is very beneficial. And whenever they've tried to rein those governments in, things go worse. But the autocratic part, I think, is also very important in that Well, let me go back a bit to a reaction to your talk. When we talk about you pull the lever and the machine doesn't go, I think that one of the big problems is that, A, it's not one machine. There's many different bureaucracies, parts to the machine. And maybe they're not better thought not as machines, but as like a fungal growth that sort of does its own thing and has its own incentives and grows its own way. And so when you think of these bureaucracies, the problem is not that they're not going, it's that they have incentive structures to do their own thing, and they are going. They're accomplishing their own objectives. And if you're the Department of Defense, your goal is essentially to grow yourself as a bureaucracy, to get more money, to get more staff, to get more managers, and that's the same with all bureaucracies. Their whole point is to grow themselves and to avoid accountability and to avoid losing money. And so that all of their incentive structures are totally different from the idea of you have a purpose as a a state or a country or a company, and you're trying to achieve that objective, no, the bureaucracies do not have the same objective. They have a totally different objective. And the only way to overcome that is through centralized power at the top that says, no, our objective as a collective organization is to go and accomplish this goal, whatever it is, and to keep the bureaucracies in line. And what China does have is a very powerful executive who can do that and holds people accountable. I mean, one thing you'll notice is endemic to the West in various societies that have all kinds of failings and inefficiencies, let's say, is that no one is ever held accountable for anything. And that is sort of the purpose of bureaucracy, so that procedures and stuff can be manipulated and that no one can be held accountable for anything. Whereas in China, people disappear and you don't see them again, which maybe we don't want to do that, but there is accountability for problems. And so that is how a meritocracy, mission-centered meritocracy can function. So China has both a decentralized aspects and a centralized aspect, and I think that has helped them. Although they certainly have their own problems, I'll say that. But I think they do have some advantages over how things have evolved in the West.
I mean, perhaps that is a problem of the rules-based order. And, you've written about this lately, about the post-1945 moment and how that epoch is now coming to an end. And some of the stuff that I described was about how the world is strangled by rules now, and everything has a caveat, and everything is sort of primary to the secondary, secondary to the primary purpose. And I wonder whether the fact that this is an essential paradox of democracy and of liberal democracy, and maybe we can get into the kind of the distinction between those two things.
Well, I'm not sure I'd say it's an essential characteristic of democracy so much as maybe liberalism, if you want to call it that, in the sense that our societies like to run themselves by processes because, for various reasons, we are skeptical of autocrats, people in power with decision-making. They have too much power in their hands. I mean, you have in Britain, as you were saying, the prime minister has almost no power. I think that's basically by design.
He has huge amounts of power in theory, but basically not in practice, right? So yeah,
exactly.
I completely agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And instead, power has been devolved into a system of bureaucracies, and even outside the state, the Quangos and the NGOs and all these bodies who actually make decisions, but it's split up. And we sort of do that on purpose because we do not, in the West, the liberal West, do not like politics. And we don't like politics in the sense of real political questions of here's what we should do, here's who we are as a country, here's what our mission is, these people are not our country, here are our enemies. These kind of very fundamental questions we try to avoid because they're uncomfortable. And so we like rule by lawyers, essentially. And you'll notice that almost all these, lawyers are everywhere in government now, and in private firms too. And what a lawyer is basically enshrining this idea of management by rules. And in that way, we also avoid accountability at the same time, because nothing is personal, it's all about rules of the system.
Yeah, and things like the Office of Budget Responsibility in the UK and these sort of quangos and secondary bodies that tear a piece out of government. And I guess, that kind of brings us right back round to the central paradox of tonight, which is like, is technocracy better in that, having a very kind of directed technocracy with the fetters taken off is better than just having lots of little technocracies around the sides?
Well, I think a technocracy that works is better than one that doesn't. Singapore, it's better to be in Singapore and have a government that's functioning well like that than to have one that's dysfunctional. But I am personally am very skeptical in the sense that I think the problem is deeper than our managerial state is malfunctioning. The problem is that you have a managerial state in the sense that all these bureaucracies have sprouted up, all these quangos and everything, out of a deeper desire to control things, to have control over everything, and to manage it. That's why it's managerial. It's this thirst to manage everything. And so even if you try to reform that system, which becomes this very complex system in a technical sense, that it's so complex that if you pull one lever, you don't know what's going to happen. And so it's almost impossible to reform. But the reason this grows up is because of this deeper unwillingness to just let things be and do their own thing, like to have a laissez-faire approach to anything. And I think what we saw, say, during COVID, I think the best critique of Dominic Cummings is that when COVID hit, his response, maybe this is arcane, maybe it's not, but his response was very much to double down on the idea of lockdowns and so on in the UK, which is the instinct to control that I'm talking about, and I think was sort of a disaster for the country, as happened many places, when a more hands-off approach would have been a lot better. But that's sort of completely out of the instinct of people in government all over the West today, and in China, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, here we're getting back to, I don't know, a sort of a prelapsarian world where you could just do things. Cummings has been talking lately, and Andrew, you and I were talking a little bit before the show about the Admiralty in the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and how there was a system of, I guess, just sort of the buying of commissions and general kind of favoritism, and like, I am the Rear Admiral, I've got my guys, I'm bringing my guys in. There's no procedural aspect to how these guys are recruited.
But here's the thing, those guys actually perform better.
Yeah,
that's actually true. There's been a lot of research on this recently. British 18th century ship captains who got their posts due to favoritism, due to patronage, due to having relatives at the Admiralty, actually performed better in combat than those who didn't. So clearly, their patrons at the Admiralty were using their kind of like personal insider knowledge in order to select meritocratically, right? Like you select your nephew, who was the one who was always getting to scrapes as a kid, loved winning fights, was always climbing trees to steal apples. You know that guy, right? You select him. And it seems to be how it worked. So obviously we can't just wind the clock back to the 18th century. Patronage as an institution is less accepted now in many, many ways, although it still exists. But at the very least, you can have that mentality a little bit more in mind and allow more executive discretion over hiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think the discretion is the key, isn't it? I mean, it's you have the goal, and then how many layers of discretion do you want to build into getting to that goal?
Well, ideally a lot. I mean, look, the nice thing is that, again, I actually don't think we're on particularly controversial territory here. There's a very large faction within the Labour Party itself that I think recognises this critique and kind of agrees with it. And one of the most striking things they did recently, so again, wind back history a bit, the Conservatives in 2012 actually turned the entire National Health Service into a quango. So they did not directly control the NHS. Now, if you know anything about Britain, you'll know that the NHS is the country's largest employer. It's one of the world's largest employers, and it constitutes around 11% of GDP, let's say. So it's a hugely important thing, right? And they just signed away ministerial control of the NHS, and that was that until very, very recently, until Labour, undid that effectively. And the reason why Labour did this is very simple. The general public doesn't know or care, right, who's actually running the NHS. The general public blames you for when the hospitals are bad. So if you're getting the blame anyway, even if technically it's not your fault, why not just have the responsibility? At least then you can do something about it. So again, it's common sense stuff.
And yeah.
There is a building bipartisan consensus in this direction.
Well, and here we get to the American example, the American experiment, if you will, of DOGE et al., where the Trump administration has come in and has decided that we will just do things and we'll sort it out with the voters in 2 years' time. And, that there is a lot of lassitude going on. And I tend to feel that, the public is slightly impressed and not particularly concerned about the Trump regime sort of towing a very sharp line with things like the rule of law and what is an executive order and how much can you sort of wangle around the judiciary and the rule of lawyers. Nathan, have you been following the DOGE story? Do you have a sense of whether you feel that is this kind of, populist post-technocracy that we've been talking a bit about tonight?
Well, yes. I said earlier that how you control bureaucracies is through concentrated executive power. That's what DOGE is. It's special unit basically set up by the president himself. The president having more power than British Prime Minister, but even in a normal administration, not that much power compared to the bureaucracies. That's what Trump experienced in his first term. So he comes in this second term and basically pushes the limits on the rule of law, as you put it, to say, no, I am the executive. I have full control over the executive agencies, which under the Constitution are supposed to be under my management, no one else's. The entire idea of an independent agency is antithetical to democracy. And so he sets up DOGE and gives them the mandate to go in under the authority of the president and to basically reorganize or fire or do whatever needs to be done to change these agencies. I think that is basically the only way to reform the agencies or to make fundamental changes to these kinds of organizations. You can't just put in a new head of the organization and have them go and say, oh, we want to change things, because the whole organism of the bureaucracy exists to resist change in that way, unless it change that grows their power and budget. So the only way to do it is through means like have been employed by the president. And yes, there can be a whole argument over whether what he's doing is legal or not, but I think what has been realized by the administration is that they cannot change these organizations without pushing the limits on this.
And is this the coming thing? It's a question for either of you, or both of you, really, because we've seen, the rise of a certain new brand of rightist, authoritarian, relatively strong man. Bukele in El Salvador is perhaps the paradigmatic example. And, culture is mimetic, and the fact that this is happening in America has influenced people in Britain. The sort of movement has grown much stronger around it. Is there a general tone or temper in the West now? We see a lot of data that says that the youth, people under 25, under 30, are much more comfortable with the idea of semi-authoritarianism and real leadership than their older, sort of more boomer-coded rule of law elders. Is that the way of the future?
Shall I take that first? Sure. Yeah, look, if you're... I'll ignore Bukele for now, because he's a special example. At my company at Bismarck, we did a big Bismarck brief recently on El Salvador, and look, the reality is, El Salvador was not even a failed state. It was a non-state. There had been no state in El Salvador since the 1930s, okay? It's like Bukele is just doing the basics of building a functioning state. All right? It's not... the whole authoritarian thing or democratic relapse does not even apply in a different universe. Ignore him. But, look, again, I think there is, it's obviously true, actually, that there is that there is a growing bipartisan consensus across the left and the right, particularly in Europe, that governments need to have the power to improve people's lives, right? See all this polling data everywhere that, young people are kind of more ambivalent about democracy. People are increasingly very, very pessimistic about the future. They don't believe governments can make them any can make anything better. You see this sort of expressed behavior in other ways, with how fertility rates are kind of tanking everywhere. The decision not whether to have a child is kind of like the ultimate investment in the future, right? So the ultimate statements of like, I think there will be a world that is at least as good as the world I'm in, the world where I grew up in, and ideally better, right? That's what having a child is. And yeah, look, yes. So the answer is kind of yes. But I don't think it's unique to the right. I think everyone realizes this now, right, left, center. Governments have to be able to make their people's lives better.
Nathan?
I would say yes, but I would say this is not a turn against democracy. It's a reassertion of it. Because when we have a managerial state that is highly technocratic and everything is run by dysfunctional bureaucracies, by this managerial class, that is not a democracy, that's an oligarchy. And what we've seen across the West is populations, democratic populations, becoming extremely frustrated that the democratic desires that they keep voting for never happen, such as on immigration. And so when populists, let's say, are supporting a sort of strongman figure, what that is an alliance of the democratic many with a sort of quasi-monarchical single figure. And in an alliance, which is a very historically common alliance, against what? It's against the nobility or the aristocracy or the oligarchy in the middle. It's a high-low alliance. And so what's happening is that the people are, through a democratic power, empowering figures that they think can successfully fight the oligarchy in the middle. And I think that's what we're seeing happen, certainly in the United States, and I think it could certainly happen in the UK, although I'm not as familiar with the details, but I think that the spirit is there. I mean, I think the people in the UK are very frustrated with how things are going and the institutions basically being broken and all these problems that are never solved, and what they want to see is for those problems to be solved, and that's sort of a democratic wish that they're no longer think the oligarchic institutions can fulfill, but only maybe a single figure or a very strong central figure.
And we sort of look to the hills from whence our salvation comes, but it's not always obvious that it does come, because politicians don't tend to be in alliance with organizers. And it just seems that, there are a lot of populists have been elected in recent times who have done nothing. One thinks of Brazil as maybe the best recent example. I mean, is there a way of kind of uniting these forces more cleanly, more obviously?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen in the United States what the new model may be, which is essentially populist forces combined with a faction of the elite, let's say, that was very dissatisfied with how things were going, which was the Silicon Valley tech elite, like Elon Musk. And so this counter-elite, let's say, joined forces with populist energy to push into power this administration, which both felt could have a sweeping away of the old forces of reaction, if we want to say that, that were in their way, and which is these bureaucracies that were strangling both the democratic forces and these Silicon Valley types who felt that this regulatory bureaucracy was strangling them too.
Andrew, Britain has a small but sincere, Silicon Valley style elite. And you were saying to me just the other day that there is a kind of this well of anger of young, smart, young Turk kind of angry people who understand where the problems are, is out there. I've talked a bit about how that could coalesce into a movement and how there are camp followers of our guru, but you are maybe a bit closer to that. I mean, do you think that could congeal into something meaningful?
Yeah, well, in some shape or form. I mean, look, if you're under 40 in Britain, it's just incredibly obvious to you that something somewhere has gone very, very seriously wrong. You're paying some of the highest rents in the world for some of the lowest quality housing, especially of any rich country. You're paying very, very high taxes, especially once your student loan repayments are factored in. And you can't afford to, and you've got very little hope really, unless you earn a very, very, really, really good salary, or you inherit a lot of money from your parents, of ever really like buying a home or affording to have a family. So it's not that surprising that people are angry, and even people I know who are doing well for themselves personally, they can just obviously see in their friendship groups that something somewhere has gone very wrong. So even people who are not like personally that angry themselves still can just see something is wrong. So something will change, but the current status quo may have a little bit further to run. Historically, deeply entrenched, very old regimes with a long history do not fundamentally reform themselves absent some kind of sort of major cataclysm, right? Like losing a giant war, let's say. Now, we would all prefer to avoid the giant cataclysm bit, right? I hope. I certainly would, because I live in Britain. There are a few examples in history of regimes reforming themselves without the giant cataclysm. Diocletian's reforms of the Roman Empire might be one good example. Probably the best is maybe the Meiji Restoration in 19th century Japan, which sort of, took Japan from this sort of incredibly isolated, archaic feudal state and very, very quickly sort of changed its whole political system, centralized power around the emperor and his court, and, built a modern industrial society that became a great power incredibly quickly. So it can, and that was not occasioned by losing a war, right? It wasn't, nothing terrible had happened to Japan yet, although they did realize, they sort of suddenly were forced to realize they were very weak relative to the other world powers. So it can happen, and there's the energy is there. It's just a question of harnessing it and building the right infrastructure to put it all together.
Unfortunately, most of the British young people and the British sort of elite are very progressive coded, and there doesn't seem to be much political movement around that as it stands. Silicon Valley made the switch from very left coded to this kind of breakaway faction who went right. Is that the way it has to go? I guess that is the thing that we're putting all of our tickets on.
I don't know, define progressive. I don't think young people are that progressive.
Don't you?
No.
Okay.
Look, everyone, again, I think there's a fairly widespread realization that mass immigration, particularly the giant wave of mass immigration from sort of 2021 onwards, was a mistake. I think that, and especially if you're a young person, it's having huge effects at the bottom end of the labor market. Just so much harder to get a job. Graduate employment rates, sort of immediately after graduating from university, I think, are now back to where they were in 2009, right? Just after the giant financial crisis that did so much damage to the economy. I think a lot of that is because of the economy is weak, but also just this incredible just too many people at the bottom of the labor market. So again, it's not like I don't think the young are that progressive. Sure they would, none of them are going to be thrilled about their 37% effective tax rate on the 25k salary, much higher marginal rate. Who's thrilled about that? No one.
But there needs to be a narrative somewhere in all of that draws them in, a sense of why the world is broken and how it can be remade. And I don't see anyone really coming up with that who's in serious frontline politics.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Great.
Give it time.
Could I throw it open to the floor at this point? Yes. We have a question there from the gentleman in black. Can we get a microphone to him? We're just going to wait for the microphone. The microphone is coming. The microphone descends. And there is the microphone.
Staying with the theme of the night, Cummings-ism and small groups. This may be for Nathan, but for all of you, there are some examples where small groups were used to be able to to change a country, at least temporarily. And the one I'm going to throw out may not be apropos, but the whiz kids during World War II, McNamara was part of that. And they went into all of those bureaucracies and they turned them around and they put them towards a new purpose, which focused on production and things like that. But they used data very early on, using data, and which is also throwing over to you, using data to be able to drive change and decision making, especially with a strong executive as we have today, as opposed to those brilliant guys walking in and just saying, I want the keys to the car and I'm going to do whatever the heck I want to do. So is there a way of doing it a better way by using some of the Cummings theory and maybe using data with that old model as I'm talking about? Or is it just you have to blow up the ship?
Well, I mean, I think DOGE is using data. In fact, that is their great innovation, is that the previously reform attempts of these bureaucracies, would go and the agency head appointed by the president would go in and he'd say, oh, show me how much you're spending on this. What are you doing with all this money? Tell me this and that. And the bureaucracies would go, oh, it's hard to say, and we'll get you a meeting in 2 months about this or whatever. They would delay and obscure the facts by the nature of their being very opaque. And the key to what Elon has done is he went in and to the payment system and got access to that through the president. Cummings has called it root access, which I think is a good term. So they can see where all the payments are going and who's getting paid for what and what all the programs are. And so they have access to all the data. And that allowed them to cut through the intentional obscurity of the bureaucracies and to start making cuts. And so whether you think the cuts are good or not, depends on your priorities. But I think that they are using data, and that is an innovation that we haven't really seen before, at least in the United States, on how they approached doing this.
I'll add a little bit more. I'll answer the question maybe a little more holistically. Better data analysis, would certainly make government run better, make it more helpful. But to do that, you kind of have to collect the data to begin with and integrate it. And in the British context, this is surprisingly often not done. I'll give you one example, which was the sort of big energy price crisis of 2022. Russia invades Ukraine, gas prices soar. The British government wants to do, feels it needs to do, I didn't want to do it, but it felt it needed to do a sort of household energy subsidy, right? Now, how would you do this? Well, ideally, for it to be maximally effective, you would target it at the poorest households and the ones that have the highest energy needs, right? So sort of like poor people living in big houses, right? But then they ran into two problems. The first of which was, I don't think they had any actual data on household energy usage. That was one problem. Another one was they actually almost had no data on household finances, because in Britain, taxation is at the individual level, right? Not at the household level, as in the US. So, me and my wife, we do all our taxes completely separately. So what they wound up doing was they wound up doing the subsidies by which property tax band you were in, which sort of loosely correlates with sort of wealth and the size of your house. But I mean, it was only a rough proxy for it, right? So this subsidy program was sort of vastly way more inefficient than it needed to be. So that's just one example. Again, I think in Britain we're a little ways off with some of this stuff. In order for the McNamara WizKid thing to work in Britain, they would need to have something to be working with, and that something is often not there yet. The Office for National Statistics basically just doesn't really work. It lost huge amounts of its best statisticians, its best personnel, when a past government forced it to move to Newport. How do I describe Newport? What's a particularly horrible bit of Hungary?
Stop.
Okay, I'll stop. All right, or it's like forcing them to move to, or it's like forcing a bunch of elite government bureaucrats to move from like DC to like rural Alabama, right? Except Alabama's much nicer than Newport. I apologize to anyone watching who lives in Newport, but you get my picture. That sort of destroyed the Office of National Statistics as an institution. It's just never been the same since. So we're a little ways off on that one.
Callum, did you have a question or a point about what is the worst town in Hungary?
I don't know, a question.
Oh, great. Okay.
There are no bad towns in Hungary.
Of course. Yeah. I'm so sorry.
Okay, so 2 questions. So I've never actually been a big fan of Dominic Cummings for a number of reasons. But one of the things I find interesting about him, he's quite a quantum character. On the one hand, he seems to be this very anti-technocratic guy, the way he talks, but he also, in the way he analyzes, seems to be like an uber technocrat, and I've never quite reconciled these two things. Also, his position was he wanted to help Britain escape from unaccountable power in the EU, but then he wants to centralize power in the Prime Minister's office and bypass Parliament as well, which is actually the source of sovereign power in the UK, at least by my interpretation. And I've never quite worked out what he is. And the second, my question is, what is your view on Dominic Cummings? Is he a cure to the problem that ails us, or is he a symptom of the problems we have? The second question I have for you, I think Nathan mentioned about rules-based, things running on rules and sort of a legal, rational understanding of how things work, and that's been basically failing, right? Max Weber famously has these 3 types of authority. There's traditional, so monarchical power, that's just the way we've always done it. Then there's charismatic, which tends to be revolutionary and short-lived. And the third is legal rational. Now, if the argument is that legal rational is failing, where does one turn? Because a revolutionary power is by definition fairly short-lived, and there is a revolutionary element at Cummings. And we haven't got a long-standing tradition of some alternatives. So if the legal rational model is failing, and I agree it's kind of a bit played out and tired right now, certainly in the UK, probably elsewhere, what's the alternative?
Well, let me take the first one. First. You're always going to need some technocrats, right? You got to have some, and they better be good. Especially in a world where the state takes, 38% of GDP in taxes, right? It's a pretty unusual thing, historically, right? In the days of Diocletian, the Roman Empire probably took like 5 to 10% of GDP in taxes. In 18th century Britain, the state took about 8% of GDP in taxes, right? So the state was just way, 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 way smaller. It just didn't offer many services. It took about the same percent of GDP in taxes as a sort of low-performing African country today, right? These great empires of the past. So in a world where we are much richer. Government services are, I think, a superior good. People's demand for them sort of rises even faster than their incomes do. And it's hard to kind of push back against that too much. You can a bit, but not too much. So you're always going to need some technocrats, right? However, going back to what Nathan said, first of all, I think it's hugely important that the technocrats are, to some degree, decentralized, right, as in China. And I totally agree. This is like the great strength of the Chinese government model. And secondly, that they are in some ways receptive to feedback from the electorate, right? Which happen, and that last bit happens in pretty much everywhere. It does happen in China, as I'm sure Nathan could tell you. Like there is actual there is some sense of receptivity from technocrats feel they are responsible and responsive in some ways. So I think that's partly how you square it. And I would also add, I think there is a sort of a lesser known vein of Cummings thought that sort of is more to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And yes, within Whitehall, you sort of centralize power in the Prime Minister's office, but overall, you would try to decentralize by sort of rebuilding powerful local government that in Britain doesn't exist. The British state collects the most tax centrally of almost any country in the world, certainly any rich country, whereas in the US, the state collects a lot of tax. In China, I think the provinces as well. In Germany, the same thing. The federal areas collect a lot of the tax. So this is like a lesser-known vein of Cummings thought that we haven't talked about, but it is out there. I think that's how you reconcile that one. And the other one, symptom or a cure. I mean, look, it's like the French Revolution. It's too early to tell.
Well, the second one's more about if the legal rational order.
Oh, sorry. Yes, that was the other. Yes, that was the other. That was the third question.
Yeah. What still said it? I mean, we haven't got a traditional model. The charismatic model is inherently unstable. Like, I suppose actually implied in this is this: what is the problem Cummings is trying to solve? Fundamentally, what is the problem Cummings is trying to solve? Fundamentally, not a technocratic problem or inefficient government. Fundamentally, what is the deeper existential problem we're facing that people like Cummings, I suppose, by your account, perhaps Gavin's, maybe even Nathan's, offers a solution to?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure he himself really conceives of it in those terms. In fact, I'm pretty sure he doesn't. But what I would say is that, Britain is a very, 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 very old country, right? It's been around for a very long time. Same as Japan, right? Japan, also has been around for a very, very long time. And the thing about being such an old country is you can kind of just find a precedent for anything, So when you say there's no precedent of sort of, charismatic governance, well, once upon a time, people believed in the divine right of kings, I'm not saying that's going to come back or anything like that, but it's not that hard for me to imagine alternatives to the current legitimating methods for the elite. Things could be different. It'd be very easy to find precedents for that. Would people be receptive? Maybe, possibly, yes. I mean, look, I don't think liberal democracy is going anywhere. I don't think it should go anywhere. It's pretty great, but maybe it needs to be supplemented and added onto by a sort of a more mystical sense of governing. And I mean, look, in 18th century Britain, when we were at our sort of a country on the up, when we built the empire and all this stuff, the crown was still a very, very powerful political actor. There's a sort of bizarre Whig history that says the Hanoverian kings didn't have any powers. It's totally wrong. The Hanoverian kings really had a pretty substantial whip to crack, and they did crack it. And they had enormous powers of patronage to go with it. So, could the crown itself perform that role again? I don't know. I have no idea, really. Should ask the king, maybe. He's got some thoughts on this. He's hinted at sort of having thoughts on this on a few occasions. Did you see his speech that he gave after the Queen died? It was very interesting. He said something like, there have been many constitutional changes in Britain over the last 70 years, but we have always been here. And it was very interesting because he sort of draw that distinction between the permanent and the temporary, but you also didn't actually say whether or not any of these constitutional changes have been good. So, yeah, I think there's a recognition that a bit more is needed. Things could be a little different. I guess we'll see.
Well, I mean, but in terms of what is Cummings' project, what is his meaning, and how distinct is he from the sovereignty of Parliament, which is the absolute kind of sine qua non of the British Constitution, as we are taught to understand it, have come to understand it. I mean, in order for that to be both true and valid, you need to raise the quality of parliamentarian quite a lot, I think, in this day and age. And I think there's something there about populism, about people coming from the outside and enacting something that is, quasi-revolutionary. One is minded of Cromwell talking to the Rump Parliament. You've been in this place too long for any good you have done. Now, in the name of God, go. That people like Cummings represent in terms of the institution is fundamentally dead. Let's have a fresh start. We can call that all kinds of things, and it can engender itself. It can come to be in many different ways, and there is this infinite continuity of the monarchy that provides the spine through which to kind of leverage and renew different types.
By the way, at this point, we're now firmly into the realm of Sabisky thought.
Right, okay.
This is firmly my own stuff now. We still see elements of the sort of pre-modern ultra-democratic constitution. Ministers are still appointed from the Lords. Very senior ministers are still appointed from the Lords. And the way you get into the Lords is just the Prime Minister puts you there. So, I mean, in theory, you could have a whole government entirely appointed from the Lords. In theory, I think the Prime Minister himself could even be... The Prime Minister himself doesn't have to be an MP. He could be a member of the Lords. The only reason why he's not is just constitutional conventions. So...
Okay, let's have another question from the lady behind Callum.
Thank you. Is that on? So I'm a journalist, and people don't usually call me a lady, so thank you so much for that.
It's my pleasure, ma'am.
I have 2 questions for Andrew. When Gavin made his introduction, he said that Dominic Cummings is like perhaps a lion in winter. He's going to come back. But I have to wonder, given how vicious he was in his attacks on Boris Johnson, of whom I'm not a fan, but as a journalist, and having been a journalist for many years in British politics, he went at him with absolute venom. It wasn't just leaks, because if anybody says to me, I'm a senior aide to the Prime Minister, I'd like to leak a story, the answer is yes, please, and we'll go into a room alone, and we'll pretend we never spoke to each other. But he made it clear he was at war. Now, if I were an important person looking for a management consultant, I would be afraid to hire Cummings, because I'd know the whole time he was taking notes, he was recording, he was probably even down doing index cards on anything I said, and that if we broke apart badly in 3 years' time, he could turn around and, having proven he was not somebody who respected confidentiality of a job, would go at me. So I wouldn't want to hire him no matter how smart he is. And I have to wonder why nobody important has hired him since he left number 10. Now, that's the first question. The second question is, Andrew, when you applied to number 10, what was in your CV that was so hot that let you jump 10,000 people?
I didn't jump 10,000 people. Gavin's wrong. No.
Promote the myth.
This is the myth. I'd actually done some. I knew Dom a little bit from beforehand, from sort of like 4 or 5 years, like before the referendum. We'd done a little bit of work together on forecasting and how it could be used in government. So that's how, basically. Like I was talking to him about going into government before he even sent out the famous blog post that was like, 10,000 people, come and.
Weirdos and misfits, I believe, was the phrase.
No. People applied that to me subsequently, but not. It was like, this is actually a misconception. As to the first question, well, has anyone here seen The Dark Knight, the movie? Sorry? Okay, right. You remember a bit where the mafia get really desperate because Batman and Gordon are trying to grab all their assets and send them all to jail. Yeah. In desperation, they reach out to the Joker as this crazy guy to solve the problem for them. They don't really understand him. They don't really want to hire him, but they feel they have to. Sometimes you hire the guy you can win. Look, realistically, I have no idea what's going to happen in 5-10 years. Politics is incredibly fluid. It's incredibly hard. It's very, very hard to predict. Future governments will hire who they will, depending on personal ties and all that kind of thing. It depends on who the Prime Minister is. But regardless, I think the one thing I will say is that if you're a young person in Britain, your entire life in some ways has been defined by this one guy, and his sort of successive campaigns, right? Especially the Brexit referendum. So again, everyone I speak to who's sort of under 35, left or right or centre, I think in some ways a lot of a really high percentage of them are sort of like Dom's children. Spiritual children. So even if he never goes back into frontline politics, there will be a huge amount of people who have read his stuff, absorbed his ideas, and that'd be true. I think they don't talk about it that much, but I think that would be true for a lot of future left-wing governments as well.
And maybe, again, as we were saying, some of that stuff is already being picked up and pipelined by the people behind Keir Starmer.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, before they won, I think Labour's sort of fundamental belief about Britain was Britain is doing badly because the Tories are bad. And they weren't wrong. Like, the Tories were bad. The Tories governed Britain terribly. I mean, just terribly. I can't put into words how bad the Tories were at governing. They were just awful. And the last couple of years in particular, they just gave up. But Labour have got to office and then realised, the problem's not just the Tories were bad. There's a huge amount. There are a lot of other problems as well. Many of them have been described by Dominic's work.
Let's have another question. Another question? John.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. Look, I apologize for not being here for your talk. I'm afraid I did have to do something. I only got away about 20 minutes ago. So I'd like to learn more about what you said before I ask a question, but I can't. My question is this. I'm looking at the people on the Labour benches behind the ministers. And I wonder if you can give me an idea of what they are about. In other words, I used to have a very clear idea of what old Labour was about. I learned what new Labour was about. But I haven't been able to get a kind of angle on, and of course I don't know the people, what the new Labour people are, the Starmerites, want, what they're really about, and whether or not you feel that they can be dealt with in a friendly way, or we must regard them as the enemies of everything we believe in.
Well, I think the main thing about the new Labour MPs, the new Labour MPs, is that a lot of them are relatively young. They're in their sort of 30s and 40s. A couple of them are even younger. And that just by itself gives you a hugely different perspective on Britain. Because these are the people who are stuck paying super high tax rates, very high marginal tax rates. Buying a house is like very, very difficult or painful, or they have to pay crazy high rents. Because sort of economic status in Britain is massively stratified by age, in a way that probably is, I think, it's very unusual, really. Probably will not. It's hard to understand, I think, if you live in Hungary. I suspect. Just because of that, they have a perspective on Britain and its problems that is very, very different to a much older and much richer Tory party. They are much more inherently inclined to believe that something is badly wrong and it needs to be fixed. I don't think, many of them I think are not super ideological people, but that's a good thing, right? I'm not a very ideological person. I'm just kind of, want to make the country better. And a lot of them got picked for being relatively clever people who would, above all, not cause too many problems and be loyal. That was the main, because, there's not really a Starmerite philosophy, and he is not a politics person, right? He seems to have got on surprisingly well with Trump, and I think a lot of it is they're both not politics people. They're both, Trump is a businessman, Starmer's a lawyer, and they both got into politics much later in life to something else to do, right? And obviously, Lady Starmer's very peaceful. I'm sure Trump has said he liked that too. But I think that's the core thing they have in common. They both kind of hate politics deep down. It certainly could be much, much worse. And just in terms of the people being relatively clever, I think that the Labour Party is currently in much better shape than the Tory Party.
Any questions? There we go.
One station in Cummings' biography that has always mystified me, and I think mystified quite a number of people, is his trip that he discussed on his blog in August of 2023 to the United States to find a center-right alternative to Trump ahead of the election. Can any of you talk about that? Does anyone have an idea what he was doing there, in what capacity, who he talked to?
I have no idea, genuinely none.
It is a mystery, yeah. Nathan, do you get the sense that I mean, Cummings has been making several trips to America. He's clearly in Congress with various Silicon Valley people. Is there more kind of cross traffic between Britain and America in that regard? Does it flow both ways? Is he sort of active in that world?
Well, I mean, I don't know the details of his travels, really, but I would say that just from reading his Substack blog, my sense is that he was not that impressed with Trump, but is now much like the Silicon Valley people, much more on board with seeing if something like that can be replicated in the United Kingdom. And he seems now much more open to sort of revolutionary change in the British system. I think inspired by the Trump Revolution, if you want to call it that. And I think that, the Silicon Valley types were also not really on board with Trump for a very long time, until sort of the last minute, almost. At some point in the campaign, there was several of them, like Bill Ackman and Elon, of course, sort of David Sachs, rallied a core group of them to support Trump, which proved, I think, decisive. So I think that I think that there is cross traffic across the Atlantic. I think that the Reform Party in Britain would love to pull something off like the Republicans in the United States if they can, and that the basic dynamic in which the old right, the old Conservative Party, which was sort of just a neoliberal technocratic party, the center right, is now sort of defunct in the United States. It's now defunct in Britain. And I think the future is a much more vibrant, or at least energetic, right wing, both in Britain and the United States and elsewhere in Europe as well. We're seeing that everywhere.
Yeah, and I guess, Cummings has been fantastically rude about Nigel Farage down the years, but I have noticed in his rhetoric he has been becoming a bit more becalmed towards him, and perhaps he is sensing that the tides are shifting, and maybe there's an alliance to be made, maybe there's a deal to be made, to pick up on your point, that this cat can have 9 or even 81 lives. And I guess that, there's the British state needs someone like that, and who are you going to call when the chips are down?
I mean, also, it's a basic matter of electoral logic. There's just no room for 2 right-wing parties in Britain, right? One or the other of them has to die. You can't have 2. This is not a thing, In a country with proportional representation, you can have multiple right-wing parties, but in first past the post, you can't. You just lose.
Yeah, I mean, he's a man who needs a host to act through, kind of like Ludendorff, I suppose. I think we had another question over there, actually. Yeah, so did you have a question?
So you seem to question whether if young people were really that progressive, but actually it's hard to argue that young people are lacking conservative values. So are young people really not progressive, or are they, craving progression, but enjoy the kind of victim role they can hide in because of current problems in the country?
I mean, look, I don't know if anyone has used the phrase conservative values unironically in Britain for the last 15 years. All right, look, okay, here's the deal. Roger Scruton is it's like C.S. Lewis is really famous in the United States. No one cares about him in Britain. Roger Scruton is as I can walking around the streets here. There's like a little cult of Roger Scruton. He's like kind of a big deal in Hungary. No one cares in Britain, right? Look, British social conservatism extends about as far as we don't like mass immigration, right? Maybe that will change a little bit, right? Because there's some. Now you're seeing with some of the polling on Gen Z, that might change to some degree. there's some evidence that like maybe a few, like somewhat more young people are going to church than was the case 5-6 years ago. But yeah, I mean, we are what we are. But like, just because you're sort of like, vaguely progressive or whatever, Britain is fundamentally a socially liberal country, but that doesn't mean people are going to automatically sign up for like, every crazy excessive woke, like all the crazy gender stuff, or mass immigration, or really expensive energy prices, or crazy high taxes, or all this stuff, right? You just have to be realistic about where we are.
Nathan, is there a similar stratification in America? I mean, is there a genuine MAGA wave? Someone was saying that there were women in posh bars in New York wearing MAGA caps, and this was the grand sign of the vibe shift. I mean, is there an upcoming generational thing, and how is that?
I mean, there's already some polling that's been done, which, at least in the United States, the young generation, Gen Z, not the millennials. Millennials were the most progressive left-wing generation in history. The Gen Z appears to be perhaps the most conservative generation in generations. The young people are turning to the right, I would say, and I mean, many of them are still progressive, even a majority. But I think the turn is there, and you can see it in various polling data about what they believe. What I would say, though, is that they're not conservative. If you define conservative as, well, it depends how you define conservative. But if you mean conservative in the sense of, we need Scrutonian, slow change, and to conserve the institutions, and to respect the Constitution, and whatever you want to call conservatism, young people are not that. They are nearly revolutionary. I think the sense among the young is that things are very bad. The institutions are all broken. Whether you're a left-wing, whether your view on what's wrong is left-wing or right-wing, I think that most young people want to see dramatic change. So I think we see that in the West, young people basically splitting up into the far left and the far right, if you want to call it that. They're not down with the centrist parties in any way. And I think we're going to keep seeing that dynamic.
I mean, historically, that has been the role of young people, the soixante-huitards kind of onwards. It's just interesting that is now a phenomenon of the right as much as the left.
Yeah, well, you saw another example of this in Germany, right, in the recent election, where a pretty decent chunk of young men voted for the AfD, young women voted for Die Linke, the left, in like very, very, very large numbers. But they're still voting for an anti-status quo party, right? Everything Nathan just said is completely true. They're still voting for an anti-status quo party. It just happens to be the left-wing one, right? They're not voting for the CDU or the SDP. So it just doesn't increasingly just makes no sense to think about politics in terms of left or right, conservative, socialist. No one cares about any of this stuff. There's pro-status quo and there's anti-status quo. But I see this all the time in Britain, where now among younger people my age and below, you sort of get weird social relationships and people hanging out together who are ostensibly politically very far apart, sort of like, right, hard right, hard left, like the Navarro media people. But if you sort of think of them all as part of like a grand anti-status quo alliance, then it kind of makes more sense. And by the way, you could be a centrist. Cummings, basically, the way I would describe Dom and all the vote leave people is they're basically like centre-right anti-status quo people. And the Tony Blair Institute, who are sort of like the left-wing, sort of like revolutionary technocrats, they are the centre-left anti-status quo people. So there's sort of this giant anti-status quo alliance. I don't think it's that hard to put it all together.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to watch that alliance really start to coalesce. I don't know if you're familiar with Navarro Media.
Of course I am. Great people.
Yeah, well, this is it. It's like
but here's the thing. Like, look, if I was in government with Aaron Bastani, he's a British kind of left-wing populist who works for Navarra, and he said, we were in the government together, and he said, Sabs, I want to nationalise the whole energy market. I'd be like, well, okay. Wouldn't be my first choice, and the first problem would be where you would find the $350 billion it would cost to do this, but let's assume we solve that problem. I'd be like, okay, look, Aaron, go ahead, fine. It would for sure be better than the status quo, which is like a kind of quasi-privatized market but with giant distorting subsidies everywhere. And, a nationalized, centrally planned market would be vastly better. So yeah, everyone can recognize the status quo in so many places as sort of just not working, and some kind of radical solution it couldn't be too much worse.
Yeah, Bastani is an interesting guy in that he seems like his leftism is driven, I guess, more by techno-optimism than by anger or sort of malice. And he's become one of these people who...
He wrote a whole book called Luxury Automated,
yes.
Fully Automated Luxury Communism, which sounds great. Sign me up for that.
Sounds great, yeah, if you can get that. Yeah, free ice cream. But he has been drifting, and he's been drifting into these kinds of circles over time, and we're just waiting for the day when he flips, and the Grand Horseshoe Coalition is complete. Do we have one more question, maybe? Hugo.
Less of a question, more of a remark. So, more to your point, Andrew, of people from the hard right, the hard left hanging out with each other. Beyond cohabitation, I believe we've been seeing some overlap, you could say. Up two examples in mind. For instance, you have you mentioned Germany. You mentioned Die Linke, AfD. There's also the socially conservative hard left of the BSW, Bundesrat Wagenknecht, so like Stalinist. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, in France, I do remember, during the last snap election in June 2024, the Minister of the Economy, Bruno Le Maire, accused Marine Le Pen's National Rally as having a Marxist economic program. So that is to say, not maybe self-referentially, but hard right, hard left, there do seem to be not just cohabitation, but overlap in the themes. I don't know if you agree, disagree.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, look, we say like hard right, hard left, but look, the reality is, Britain is not only a socially liberal country, but it's a very, very, very moderate country, right? Our hard right is Nigel Farage, who is, the sort of right-wing end of sort of like liberal civic nationalism, right? And the hard left is sort of like Jeremy Corbyn, who is basically a sort of leftist social democrat with some mildly eccentric opinions on foreign policy, right? Those are the extremes of British politics, right? It's a very, very, very moderate, temperamentally moderate nation. So therefore, the one thing I will say is I think some of these comparisons to France or Germany are a little bit, need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because in those countries you do have a much more vibrant and living tradition of political extremism, both right and left, that just doesn't exist in Britain. And I think it will become a thing, but I think it'll be very, 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 very fringe for the foreseeable future.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, I'd like to draw things to a close and say thank you very much to our panelists, Andrew Sabisky and Nathan Levine, and to you, our kind and intelligent audience. I'm Gavin Haynes. This has been the Danube Institute. Good night.